The bus rumbled along Main Street, passengers lost in their thoughts. Among them, Earl Johnson, a frail-looking black man in his 70s, quietly stared out the window, his worn cane resting against his knee. It was just another evening, until the bus stopped near Lincoln High. 4 teenagers boarded, laughter sharp and cocky. One spotted Earl and smirked. "Yo, check out Grandpa. You lose your retirement home?" Earl didn't flinch. He simply turned, eyes steady. "You boys really don't know, do you? What happens next will change everything. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you stand for justice, hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this." Earl Johnson had always been a man of few words, but those words carried weight. Born in the Deep South during the 1950s, he'd grown up in a world that never let him forget the color of his skin. Segregated schools, separate water fountains, and the lingering threat of violence weren't just stories from history books, they were his reality. But Earl had learned early on that survival didn't come from fighting every battle. It came from choosing the right ones and standing firm when it mattered most. By the time he was 18, the Vietnam War was raging. Draft notices were like death sentences for young men, especially black boys from poor neighborhoods. When Earl's envelope arrived, his mother cried quietly at the kitchen table, wiping her hands on a faded dish towel. His father, a man hardened by decades of hard labor and silent suffering, just nodded. "Do what you gotta do, boy," he said. Earl didn't argue. There was no point. Arguing had never changed the world for men like him. Basic training wasn't just about learning to shoot or march. It was about surviving humiliation. White drill sergeants made sure black recruits understood their place, barking orders with a venom that went beyond military discipline. Earl took it all in stride, never reacting, never giving them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He knew what real strength looked like, and it wasn't in the screaming faces of men drunk on borrowed power. It was in endurance, in surviving. What others thought should destroy you. Vietnam was hell, but it was also the great equalizer. Bullets didn't care about skin color. In the jungle, Earl earned respect the only way that mattered, by keeping his unit alive. He pulled wounded men from under fire, navigated through treacherous terrain when maps failed, and stood guard during sleepless nights while others rested. Even the most hardened racists among his fellow soldiers couldn't deny his courage. They didn't have to like him, but they sure as hell trusted him. But war leaves marks deeper than scars. When Earl came home, he wasn't greeted as a hero. Black veterans returned to the same America they had left, an America that saw them as troublemakers rather than defenders of freedom. Jobs were scarce, housing was harder, and the GI Bill seemed to get lost in the paperwork more often for black soldiers. Earl didn't complain. He'd survived worse. He settled into life quietly, working odd jobs, fixing cars, and keeping his head down. Now, decades later, Earl lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood had changed, but not for the better. What was once a tight-knit community of working-class families had become a patchwork of boarded-up storefronts and silent streets after dark. Earl didn't mind the quiet. He'd had his fill of noise in Vietnam and the years that followed. His days were simple. Wake up early, stretch his aching joints, read the paper, and take the bus into town for groceries and errands. The cane he carried wasn't for show. Years of wear and tear on his body, combined with an old shrapnel wound in his hip, made walking a slow, deliberate process. But Earl never let the cane define him. To him, it was just another tool, like his rifle had been once, a means to keep moving forward. He didn't expect respect from the world that had been beaten out of him long ago, but he did expect peace. He'd earned that much, hadn't he? A quiet life, minding his own business, bothering no one. Yet, in places like this town, places where old prejudices died hard, peace was never guaranteed. Earl had learned that lesson countless times, and he was about to learn it again. That morning had started like any other. Earl had risen before dawn, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and watched the sun rise from his tiny balcony. The world outside was already stirring, garbage trucks rumbling down the street, kids dragging their feet toward school, and the faint sound of a preacher's voice from a nearby radio. Earl liked these moments. The in-between spaces where life hadn't quite picked up speed yet. He'd taken the bus downtown, stopping first at the VA clinic for a routine checkup. The nurse, a young white woman with tired eyes, barely looked at him as she took his blood pressure. "Everything looks fine," she said flatly, scribbling notes without meeting his gaze. Earl didn't take it personally. He'd seen that look before, the one that said, "You're just another old black man, another body passing through the system." It didn't bother him, not anymore. After the clinic, he stopped by the corner store for groceries. The clerk, a middle-aged white man named Frank, barely hid his disdain as Earl counted out cash for a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few cans of soup. "You people always pay in cash," Frank muttered, shaking his head. Earl said nothing. Words wouldn't change Frank's mind. They never did. As Earl exited the store, he saw the first sign that today wouldn't be like the others. Across the street, leaning against the wall of the gas station, stood Kyle and his crew, teenagers full of the kind of swagger that came from never having faced real consequences. Kyle was the ringleader, tall and broad-shouldered, with the cocky grin of someone who'd always gotten away with everything. His sidekicks, Troy, Blake, and Connor, were shadows, mimicking Kyle's arrogance without his natural charisma. They spotted Earl immediately. Kyle elbowed Troy, nodding toward the old man. "Look at this fossil," Kyle sneered. "Bet he fought dinosaurs, not wars." The others laughed, loud enough for Earl to hear. He didn't react. He never did. Attention only fed bullies. He'd learned that long before these boys were even born. Earl made his way to the bus stop, groceries balanced carefully in one hand, cane in the other. The bus arrived on time, a rare blessing, and Earl boarded without incident. He found his usual seat near the back, where the vibrations from the engine were less jarring on his old bones. He settled in, gazing out the window as the town rolled by in shades of gray and brown. But peace, as always, was fleeting. At Lincoln High's stop, Kyle and his crew climbed aboard, voices already raised, energy buzzing like static before a storm. Earl didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel their presence, sharp and intrusive like broken glass underfoot. "Yo, check it out," Kyle's voice cut through the bus's dull hum. "Grandpa's still here. Thought the museum closed hours ago." Laughter followed. Earl closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. Choose your battles, he reminded himself. This wasn't one worth fighting. Not yet, but Kyle wasn't one to back down. He swaggered down the aisle, his friends close behind until they stood over Earl's seat. "What's in the bag, old man?" Kyle asked, nudging the grocery sack with his foot. "Cat food? Or you just eating straight out the can these days?" Earl opened his eyes, calm and cold. He'd seen this play out too many times before. Bullies always push until they hit something harder than themselves. "I said," Kyle repeated, louder this time. "What's in the bag?" Earl's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his cane. He met Kyle's gaze, unflinching. "Groceries," he said simply. "Groceries?" Kyle mocked, snatching the bag and holding it aloft like a trophy. "Bet it's all government. Handouts, you people love those, don't you?" The other passengers shifted uncomfortably. A middle-aged woman near the front adjusted her purse, pretending not to notice. A man in a suit glanced up from his phone, saw the situation, and quickly looked away. No one intervened. No one ever did. Earl stayed seated, spine straight, eyes fixed on Kyle. He didn't plead, he didn't flinch, and that more than anything seemed to unsettle the teenager. Kyle's grin faltered, just for a moment. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue." Earl spoke then, voice low and firm. "You boys always find fun in bothering strangers?" The bus went silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade. The challenge hung in the air, daring Kyle to respond. Troy, always eager to impress, leaned closer. "You deaf, old man? Maybe you don't speak English?" Another round of laughter. Earl didn't move. Kyle's smile returned, sharper now. "Bet he's got some cash on him," he said, tossing the grocery bag to Blake. "Check it." Blake hesitated. "Man, maybe we should chill. He's just some old dude." But Kyle wasn't backing down, not now. He leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You got a problem, Grandpa?" Earl's grip tightened on the cane, but his expression didn't change. "No problem," he said quietly. but you're about to find one." For the first time, doubt flickered across Kyle's face. Just for a second. Just long enough for Earl to know. The boy didn't understand what real strength looked like, but he would soon. The bus jolted forward as it pulled away from the curb, but the tension inside remained frozen in place. Earl Johnson sat quietly, hands resting on the curved handle of his cane, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Kyle loomed, his cocky grin widening as if he'd already won some invisible contest. "Come on, old man," Kyle sneered, stepping closer. "We're just having fun. Lighten up." Earl didn't move. He'd seen boys like this before, loud, arrogant, desperate to prove something to the world, to themselves. In the jungle, it was the new recruits who talked the biggest game, puffing their chests like roosters. They were always the first to crack when the bullets started flying. Earl had learned one thing back then. The ones who bragged the most were usually the weakest. "Fun?" Earl finally muttered, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the laughter. "Bothering strangers is what you call fun these days." Kyle's smirk faltered, just a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But Troy, ever the sidekick, stepped in to fill the void. "Man, why you acting like you're somebody?" he jeered, pulling Earl's grocery bag from Blake's hands. "What's in here, huh? Government cheese? Cat food?" Earl's eyes didn't leave Kyle. "Put the bag down, son. You don't want to do this." The calm in his voice was unsettling. It wasn't the trembling plea of a frightened old man. It was something colder, something final. The kind of tone a man used when he'd already made peace with whatever came next. Kyle didn't get it. He leaned in, his face inches from Earl's. "Or what, Grandpa? You gonna hit me with that stick of yours?" He nudged the cane with his foot, laughing as it wobbled slightly against Earl's knee. "Face it, you're just an old relic, nothing but dust and memories." The bus driver glanced nervously in the rearview mirror but said nothing. The other passengers, too, pretended not to notice. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse tighter. A man in a suit focused intently on his phone, screen dark. Everyone saw, no one spoke. It was easier that way. But Earl had never been one to take the easy road. Without warning, he moved. Quick, precise, controlled. His cane, worn smooth from decades of use, hooked behind Kyle's ankle and gave a sharp tug. Kyle's balance broke instantly, and he stumbled backward, arms flailing as he crashed into the seat behind him. The bus went silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade. Earl didn't rise. He didn't need to. He simply adjusted his grip on the cane and looked down at Kyle, who was now sprawled awkwardly on the floor, mouth agape. "Sit down, boy," Earl said quietly. "Before you hurt yourself." For a moment, no one moved. Then Troy swore under his breath, reaching down to help Kyle up. But Kyle slapped his hand away, face flushing crimson with humiliation. He scrambled to his feet, eyes burning with rage. "You think you're tough, old man?" Kyle hissed, fists clenching. "You don't know who you're messing with." Earl's gaze didn't waver. "And you don't know who you're talking to." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Something about the way Earl said it, the quiet certainty, the complete lack of fear, made even Troy and Blake hesitate. They weren't dealing with some frail retiree who'd back down at the first sign of trouble. There was steel in Earl's spine, the kind forged in places boys like Kyle couldn't imagine, but Kyle wasn't the type to walk away, not with his pride on the line. He snatched Earl's grocery bag from Troy and held it high, shaking it like a prize. "Look at this crap, man, you really living the dream, huh? Bet you bought this with welfare checks." Earl didn't blink. "Put it down." "Or what?" Kyle taunted, pulling a can from the bag and holding it up. "You gonna call the cops? Ain't nobody coming for you, old man. Nobody cares." That part, at least, was true. The other passengers remained frozen in their seats, eyes fixed on the floor or the windows, pretending to be somewhere else. It was easier to ignore injustice than to confront it. Earl had lived long enough to know that well. But he also knew something Kyle didn't. Real power didn't come from noise. It came from knowing when to strike and when to stand your ground. "Why you think this is funny?" Earl asked, his voice calm but sharp as a knife's edge. "Stealing from an old man? Mocking someone who's never done you harm? That's what passes for strength these days?" Kyle sneered, tossing the can back into the bag with exaggerated care. "Nah, Strength is knowing you can do whatever the hell you want and no one can stop you. Earl nodded slowly, as if considering the words. Then, without warning, he leaned forward just enough to make Kyle flinch. That's not strength, boy, that's cowardice. And one day you'll run into someone who shows you the difference. For the first time, Kyle hesitated. The bravado slipped, if only for a heartbeat. But then Troy laughed nervously, breaking the spell. Man, forget this old fool. He ain't worth it. Kyle's smile returned, brittle and forced. Yeah, you're right. He dropped the grocery bag onto Earl's lap, cans clinking inside. Enjoy your cat food, Grandpa. The bus screeched to a stop at the next corner. Kyle and his gang sauntered toward the exit, swagger intact, but eyes flickering nervously back toward Earl. As Kyle stepped off, he glanced over his shoulder, forcing a grin. Next time, you might not be so lucky. Earl didn't answer. He just watched them go, the steady hum of the engine filling the silence once more. Around him, passengers shifted, suddenly interested in their phones or the view outside. No one spoke. No one asked if he was okay. Earl bent down, retrieved his cane, and slowly stood. The ache in his hip flared, a reminder of old wounds that never quite healed. He winced, adjusting his weight, but the pain didn't bother him. Pain was familiar, expected, manageable, but something else lingered, something deeper than the physical discomfort. It was the knowledge that this wasn't over. Boys like Kyle didn't let go of humiliation easily. They'd be back. And next time they'd come harder. Earl stepped off the bus at his usual stop, the sun dipping low behind the buildings. The quiet streets offered no comfort, only the long shadow of what was coming. What would you have done in Earl's shoes? Comment number 1 if you stand with Earl, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe respect should be earned, not demanded. But here's the real question. Kyle walked away this time, bruised ego and all. But what happens when bruised pride turns into a thirst for revenge? Stay tuned, because the next encounter won't be so easy to walk away from. The bus rolled away, leaving Earl standing at the corner with his worn grocery bag hanging from one hand and his cane steadying the other. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks. Earl had faced worse in his lifetime, far worse. He'd walked through streets where the color of his skin made him a target, survived a war where bullets didn't care about race, but fellow soldiers often did, and returned to a country that treated him like an outsider, despite his sacrifices. But something about the way Kyle had looked back before stepping off the bus, that forced grin, the flicker of something mean and unfinished in his eyes, told Earl this wasn't over. Boys like Kyle didn't swallow humiliation quietly. They spat it back out, nastier than before. Earl trudged home, ignoring the dull throb in his hip and the sharper ache of something deeper, the knowledge that peace was never guaranteed, not for men like him. By the time he reached his modest apartment on the edge of town, the streetlights had flickered to life, casting pale circles on the cracked pavement. Earl sighed, unlocking the weathered door to the small space he'd called home for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't much, but it was his, filled with memories, photographs, and the quiet dignity of a life lived without asking for handouts or pity. He put the groceries away, each can and carton placed with the precision of an old habit. The world outside buzzed faintly, distant music from a passing car, the muffled laughter of teenagers down the block. It wasn't until Earl sat down, stretching his aching legs in the worn recliner by the window, that his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it. Few people called him these days, but curiosity got the better of him. He reached for the phone, squinting at the screen. A text from an unknown number. "Check yourself out, Grandpa. You're famous." Attached was a link. Earl frowned, thumb hesitating over the screen. His instincts, honed from years of navigating both war zones and hostile streets, told him nothing good would come from clicking that link. But age hadn't dulled his curiosity, only tempered it with caution. He tapped the link. The video started grainy, shaky, shot from the back of the bus. It showed Kyle standing over him, sneering, taunting, Earl calm and unmoving. Then the moment, Earl's cane hooking Kyle's ankle, the stumble, the crash. Laughter erupted from behind the camera, and a mocking caption flashed across the screen. Old man goes full ninja. Earl's stomach tightened as he scrolled down. The comments were worse than the video itself. Crazy how these old folks think they're tough. He's lucky Kyle didn't knock his dentures out. Bet he's one of those welfare leeches. Ain't no real vet living like that. Should have broken that cane over his head. Teach him some respect. Earl exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. He'd lived long enough to know how the world worked, especially the online world. People hid behind screens, spewing hate they'd never have the guts to say face to face. He told himself it didn't matter. It was just noise. But noise has a way of spreading. The next morning, Earl stepped out for his usual routine: coffee from the corner diner, a slow walk to the community center to read the paper and chat with other retirees. He barely made it down the block before the first sign of trouble appeared. Two teenage boys, younger than Kyle but cut from the same cloth, stood outside the gas station. One held up his phone, snickering. "Hey look, it's Kane Ninja," he called, voice dripping with mockery. The other boy laughed, mimicking a stumble and exaggerated fall. "Don't trip me, Grandpa." Earl ignored them, jaw tightening. As he pushed forward, he'd dealt with taunts all his life. Boy from white men in uniforms, lazy from employers who overlooked his qualifications, troublemaker from cops who saw his skin before his character. This was nothing new, but it didn't stop. By the time he reached the diner, the waitress, a woman who usually greeted him with a tired but friendly smile, barely glanced his way. "To go only today," she muttered, not meeting his eyes. Earl frowned. "I usually sit by the window." "Yeah, well, not today," she snapped, nodding toward the other customers. Earl followed her gaze. A man in a trucker hat, phone in hand, shook his head slowly. "Ain't no place for folks stirring up trouble," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Earl's grip tightened on his cane. He wanted to speak, to remind them that he hadn't asked for trouble, that he'd only defended himself against disrespect. But words wouldn't change minds already made up. Silence had always been his armor. He turned and walked out, the door's bell jingling like a mocking laugh behind him. Back home, the noise followed him. His mailbox, usually stuffed with junk mail and VA notices, held something new: a crumpled flyer with bold, angry letters scrawled across the front. "Know your place." No return address, no signature, just the message. Earl stared at it for a long moment before folding it neatly and placing it on the counter. He didn't throw it away. Warnings, like memories, were best kept where you could see them. That night, as the town settled into its usual quiet, Earl sat by the window, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching the street below. The phone buzzed again. Another link. Another video, this time from a local community watch page. The narrative had shifted. Elderly man attacks teens on bus. Is this what our town's come to? The comments were worse than before. Bet he's got a record, can't trust him. Another thug hiding behind age. Someone ought to teach him a real lesson. Earl's hand tightened around the coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. He'd survived worse. Racism wasn't new. Injustice wasn't surprising. But something about the speed, the relentlessness of it all, the way lies spread faster than truth, gnawed at him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Then came the knock. It was soft, hesitant, not the angry pounding he half expected. Earl stood, cane steadying his steps, and opened the door to find a young black woman standing there, phone in hand. Her expression was tense, eyes flickering past him to the street before settling on his face. "Mr. Johnson?" she asked, voice low. "My name's Jasmine Reed. I'm a journalist, and I think they're trying to bury you." Earl blinked, surprised. "Bury me? Girl, I've been buried so many times I might as well be a ghost." Jasmine didn't smile. She held up her phone, showing an email thread. "The local news station was going to run a piece on what happened. I work freelance, so I pitched them. The real story, about how you were harassed first. They passed. Said it wasn't in the community's interest." Earl grunted. "Community's interest means keeping folks like me quiet." "Exactly," Jasmine said, stepping closer. "But I'm not part of their system. I run my own site. If you're willing to talk, I'll make sure people hear the truth." Earl hesitated. He'd spent his life avoiding attention, knowing that the spotlight rarely brought justice for men like him. But the look in Jasmine's eyes, determined, defiant, unwilling to let another story get swept under the rug, reminded him of someone he used to be, someone who hadn't yet learned that standing tall often meant standing alone. "All right," Earl said finally, stepping aside. "Come on in, but don't expect me to sugarcoat anything." Jasmine nodded, already hitting record. "I wouldn't want it any other way." Outside, the streetlights flickered. Somewhere down the block, a car idled too long at the corner before rolling away, slow and deliberate. Earl watched it disappear into the night, jaw tightening. He'd faced enemies in the jungle, in the streets, in boardrooms and back alleys. But this was different. This was a battle fought in shadows, behind screens and whispers, where truth was just another casualty. And Earl Johnson wasn't about to lose another fight. Not this time. Earl sat stiffly at his kitchen table, the glow from Jasmine's phone illuminating his weathered face as he recounted the bus incident. He spoke plainly, without embellishment. There was no need for dramatics. The truth was damning enough on its own. Jasmine listened intently, nodding, occasionally glancing down to ensure the audio was clear. "They didn't just see an old man," Earl said quietly, eyes fixed on the chipped edge of his coffee mug. "They saw a target, an easy win. Someone they thought wouldn't fight back." Jasmine stopped recording and sighed. "Mr. Johnson, this isn't just about some teenagers acting out. The reaction you're getting, that's bigger than them. It's the system closing ranks." Earl nodded slowly. He'd known that long before smartphones and viral videos. Racism didn't always wear white hoods or shout slurs. Sometimes it wore a badge. Sometimes it sat behind a desk, stamping "denied" on housing applications. Sometimes it was just a bus full of silent passengers, choosing comfort over courage. The next morning, Jasmine's article went live. Vietnam vet, harassed by teens, ignored by community. How racism thrives in plain sight. She posted the full video alongside Earl's interview, highlighting the stark contrast between the boy's cocky bravado and Earl's quiet dignity. Within hours, the post exploded. Hundreds of shares, thousands of comments. But not all the attention was positive. By noon, Earl's phone rang. The voice on the other end was sharp, authoritative. "Mr. Johnson, this is Deputy Carter from the Sheriff's Office. We've had some complaints about you stirring up trouble. Mind coming down to the station for a chat?" Earl's grip tightened on the phone. "Chat? About what?" "Disturbing the peace, inciting conflict. You know how it looks, an old man, picking fights with teenagers." Earl chuckled bitterly. "Did you even watch the video?" Carter's tone didn't change. "Videos can be edited, Mr. Johnson. Best if you come in voluntarily. Otherwise, we might have to send someone." Earl hung up without another word. He wasn't about to walk into a trap, not without backup. Jasmine, sitting across the table, had already started dialing. "I've got a contact at the local news station. They didn't want this story before, but now that it's blowing up online, they'll have to cover it." But when Jasmine called, the receptionist's voice was cold. "Sorry, we're not interested in promoting divisive narratives. The sheriff's office already issued a statement, said the situation was handled." "Handled?" Jasmine snapped. "Do you even know what happened? There's video proof." "Ma'am, you're welcome to submit a formal complaint." "Have a nice day." The line clicked dead. Earl leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Told you, this town don't change, never has." But Jasmine wasn't ready to give up. She spent the next few hours blasting the story across every platform she could think of: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. The video gained traction, drawing attention from civil rights groups and veteran organizations. Comments flooded in. "How do you attack a man who fought for your freedom? Where's the outrage? Oh, right, it's easier to ignore when the victim's black. Respect your elders. Guess that only applies when they look like you." The local news couldn't ignore it anymore. By evening, a short segment aired, but the coverage was slanted. Community uproar over bus incident. Was the veteran provoked? The footage was carefully clipped, showing Earl pulling Kyle down but conveniently cutting out the prior harassment. The anchor's tone was neutral, almost dismissive. But the worst part? Deputy Carter appeared on screen, standing in front of the sheriff's office, arms crossed, badge gleaming under the harsh lights. "We've reviewed the situation," he said smoothly. "While it's unfortunate, It's clear that both parties could have handled things differently. We're reminding the public to avoid confrontations and report concerns to law enforcement instead. Earl turned off the TV, jaw clenched. Handled, huh? The next day, the harassment intensified. Earl walked to the corner store for milk, only to find the clerk, Frank, who'd always been curt but civil, standing behind the counter, arms crossed. "We're closed," Frank muttered, though the lights were on and another customer browsed the aisles. Earl didn't argue. He'd fought too many losing battles to waste energy on another. Outside, Kyle and his crew were waiting. This time, they weren't laughing. They stood by their bikes, arms crossed, faces hard. Blake held up his phone, recording. "Still running your mouth, old man." Kyle called out, voice laced with venom. "Internet fame treating you good?" Earl didn't slow down. He kept walking, cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. But Kyle wasn't done. "Should have stayed quiet," he muttered, loud. Enough for Earl to hear. "People round here don't like troublemakers." That night, Earl found the first real sign that this wasn't just teenage bravado anymore. As he returned from the community center, groceries in hand, he spotted something on his apartment door, spray-painted in jagged red letters, "Know your place." Earl stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply. He'd seen worse graffiti in his time, on diners, churches, even his childhood home. But seeing it here, on his own doorstep, hit differently. Jasmine arrived minutes later, phone already out, snapping photos. "We need to report this." "To who?" Earl asked bitterly. "The same cops protecting those boys?" Jasmine's jaw tightened. "If the law won't help, we'll go above them. I know some folks, civil rights lawyers, veteran advocates, people who won't look the other way." Earl sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Girl, you're fighting a fire with a water pistol." "Maybe," Jasmine shot back, eyes blazing. "But I'd rather fight and lose than stand by and watch." The next day, they filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office. The receptionist barely glanced at the paperwork before tossing it into an overflowing bin. Earl didn't expect anything different, but Jasmine wasn't done. She reached out to every advocacy group she could find. Slowly, the story spread beyond the town's borders. A national veterans organization tweeted the video, demanding accountability. A civil rights lawyer in the city offered pro bono support. The pressure was mounting, and that's when the sheriff's office hit back. A letter arrived in Earl's mailbox, official-looking and coldly worded. "Due to multiple complaints of disturbance and neighborhood conflict, the residence at 1428 Willow Street is under review for lease violation. Failure to comply may result in eviction." Earl read it twice, heart sinking. "They're trying to push me out." Jasmine snatched the letter, fury radiating from her. "This is retaliation, plain and simple." But Earl just chuckled darkly. Plain and simple's how they've always done it. That evening, as Earl sat quietly on his balcony, watching the sun dip below the rooftops, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. "Hello?" he answered, voice steady. The reply was chillingly familiar. Kyle's voice low and smug. "Hope you're packing, Grandpa, 'cause you ain't welcome here no more." Earl hung up without a word, staring out into the gathering darkness. The fight he'd hoped to avoid had come knocking, louder and meaner than before. What would you do in Earl's place? Comment number 1 if you believe standing up is worth the risk. Like, subscribe, and share if you think silence only fuels injustice. But here's the real question. When the system itself turns against you, how do you fight back without losing everything? Stay tuned, because Earl's about to find out the hard way. Earl Johnson woke up the next morning with the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his chest. He'd seen fights like this before, not on battlefields, but in neighborhoods where power moved in whispers and backroom deals. The spray-painted warning on his door, the eviction threat, the veiled threats from Kyle and his gang, none of it surprised him. But the speed, the relentlessness of it all, gnawed at something deep inside. It wasn't just teenage bravado anymore. This was organized, calculated, and Earl knew how dangerous cornered men could become no matter how young they were. He moved slowly through his morning routine, each ache and twinge reminding him that time spared no one. The cane, once an occasional crutch, had become an extension of himself. But it wasn't the cane that gave him strength, it was resolve. He'd survived worse than a few angry boys and corrupt deputies. He'd survived this too. Jasmine called around noon, voice tight with frustration. "Mr. Johnson, I've contacted every advocacy group I know. Some are picking up the story, but local authorities are stonewalling. The sheriff's office won't. So even confirmed the graffiti report." Earl sighed, watching a thin trail of smoke rise from his coffee mug. "They're not going to bite the hand that feeds them, girl. That's how this town's always worked." "Well, they'll have to when the right people start paying attention." Jasmine's determination was admirable, but Earl heard the edge of desperation beneath it. She was fighting an uphill battle and they both knew it. "Be careful," Earl warned. "Folk like this don't play fair." Jasmine didn't argue. She just promised to keep pushing and hung up. The rest of the day passed quietly. But quiet, in a town like this, was never comforting. It was the kind of silence that preceded a storm. Around sunset, Earl ventured out for groceries. He'd considered asking Jasmine to pick them up, but pride was a stubborn thing. He wasn't about to. Let a bunch of punk kids trap him in his own home. The streets were emptier than usual, the sky bruised purple and gold as the sun dipped behind the hills. Earl walked slowly, cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement, each step deliberate. He passed the corner store without stopping. Frank's scowl through the window told him all he needed to know. Another silent wall built by fear and prejudice. Made it to the small supermarket on 5th Street without incident, filling his basket with the essentials: bread, canned soup, a carton of milk. The cashier, a young Latina woman with tired eyes, offered a faint smile as she bagged his items. At least someone in this town hadn't forgotten their humanity. But the peace didn't last. Earl was halfway home, crossing the deserted parking lot behind the old hardware store when he heard it, the unmistakable rumble of motorcycle engines. His grip tightened on the plastic bags as he glanced over his shoulder. Kyle, Troy, Blake, Connor. 4 bikes, idling like predators, circling wounded prey. The boys weren't laughing this time. Their faces were hard, eyes sharp, with something uglier than teenage rebellion. This wasn't just about bruised pride anymore. It was about dominance. Earl kept walking, spine straight, despite the protest of tired muscles. He didn't pick up his pace. That would only feed their hunger. "Hey, Grandpa," Kyle's voice cut through the evening air, sharp and cold. "Thought we told you. You ain't welcome around here." Earl didn't answer. Silence was his armor, but Kyle wasn't having it. The engines roared and the bikes closed in, forming a loose circle around him. Earl stopped, weight shifting slightly to his good leg, cane planted firmly. Troy grinned, revving his engine. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too old to hear us?" Blake dismounted, swaggering forward. "You think that little internet fame makes you untouchable, huh? Guess again." Earl's eyes didn't waver. He'd seen that look before, in young soldiers sent to do dirty work they didn't fully understand. False confidence masking fear. The problem was, scared boys with something to prove were often the most dangerous. "Go home," Earl said quietly. "You don't want to do this." Kyle laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Nah, old man, you don't get it. This is our home. You're the one who don't belong." And then it happened, quick like the snap of a dry twig underfoot. Blake lunged, shoving Earl hard in the chest. The cane slipped, balance faltered, and Earl hit the pavement with a grunt, groceries spilling around him. Milk carton burst, bread crushed beneath Blake's boot. "Oops," Blake sneered. "Guess you should have listened." Earl lay still for a moment, not from pain but calculation. He'd learned long ago that reacting in anger gave your enemy control. Instead, he breathed deeply, ignoring the sharp ache in his hip, and slowly pushed himself up, hand searching for the cane. Kyle stepped forward, kicking the cane out of reach. "Not so tough without your stick, huh?" The others laughed, but the sound was thin, strained. Even they sensed the line had shifted from taunting to something uglier, but Kyle was too far gone to care. Earl met his gaze, eyes steady. "I've faced worse than you, boy. You got no idea what real fear looks like." Kyle's face twisted. He hated that calm, that refusal to break. "Yeah? Let's see how tough you are after this." He raised a foot, aiming for Earl's ribs, but the moment hung frozen as the blare of a car horn shattered the air. A sedan screeched to a halt at the parking lot's edge. Jasmine. She threw the door open, phone held high, camera already recording. "Back off!" she shouted, voice trembling with fury. "I've got everything on video. You touch him again and I swear this goes straight to every news station in the state." The boys hesitated. Connor, the quietest of the group, glanced nervously at the phone. "Kyle, man, maybe we should bounce." But Kyle's pride was a wildfire, burning hotter with every second. He stepped closer, eyes locked on Earl. "You think anyone cares what some wannabe journalist posts? This town don't give a damn about him, or you." Earl smiled faintly, despite the pain. "You're right," he rasped. "The town don't care, but people outside it might." Kyle's eyes flickered, just a moment of doubt, but enough. Jasmine stepped closer, camera still rolling. "Leave," she demanded. "Now, or I start." Naming names. "Your daddy might have money, Kyle, but even he can't bury this if it goes national." The balance shifted. The bravado cracked. Kyle spat on the ground, face contorted with frustrated rage. "This ain't over," he muttered, backing toward his bike. One by one, they mounted up, engines growling like caged animals. Kyle was the last to leave, middle finger raised as his bike roared past. Silence settled over the lot, broken only by Jasmine's ragged breathing. She rushed to Earl's side, crouching down. "Mr. Johnson," she gasped. "Are you all right? I'm so sorry, I saw them following you, but I didn't think—" Earl waved her concern away, wincing as he pushed himself upright. "Ain't your fault, girl. Boys like that don't need much reason to act stupid." Jasmine helped him gather the scattered groceries, what little remained intact. Her hands trembled. "This is getting out of control. They're not just messing around anymore. They could have done worse," Earl finished quietly. "Yeah, I know." They stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken fears hanging between them. Finally, Earl sighed. "Let's get home. Can't fight battles on an empty stomach." But as they walked back toward Earl's apartment, cane tapping steadily against the cracked pavement, both knew the truth. This wasn't over. The boys had crossed a line, and lines once crossed rarely stayed quiet. That night, Earl sat by the window, watching shadows stretch across the street. His hip throbbed, a dull reminder of age and vulnerability. He'd fought so many battles, survived so many wars, only to find another one waiting for him in his twilight years. The phone buzzed on the table. "Another unknown number," he answered without hesitation. "Yeah?" A pause. Then Kyle's voice, low and cold. "Should have stayed down, old man. Next time you won't get back up." The line went dead. Earl stared at the phone for a long moment, the glow of the screen fading into darkness. He didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there listening to the silence, and in that silence he made a decision. Running wasn't an option. Not anymore. This wasn't just about pride, it was about principle, about showing boys like Kyle and the men who protected them that some lines couldn't be erased, no matter how many threats they threw your way. Earl Johnson had fought for his country, for his rights, for his dignity. He'd fought enemies overseas and injustice at home. He wasn't about to back down now. The battle had come to his doorstep, and this time he was ready to fight back. Earl sat quietly in his apartment that night, the lights dimmed, the phone resting cold and silent on the table. Kyle's threat still echoed in his ears. "Next time, you won't get back up." It wasn't an idle boast. The boys had escalated, and Earl knew the next encounter wouldn't be fists and words. It would be worse. They'd tasted power, and nothing emboldened bullies like the scent of fear. But Earl wasn't afraid. He'd faced death before, in the jungles of Vietnam, where enemies didn't give warnings. He'd survived systemic oppression, racist laws, and the silent violence of being ignored, passed over, pushed aside. This was just another battlefield, and Earl Johnson had never left a battlefield without a fight. The next morning, Earl made 2 calls. The first was to Jasmine. She answered on the first ring, voice tight with worry. "Mr. Johnson, are you all right? I've been trying to reach you." "I'm fine," Earl replied, voice steady. "But I'm done playing defense. It's time to hit back." Jasmine hesitated. "Hit back how? You saw what they're capable of." Earl's eyes narrowed. So did they. And they're about to learn what happens when you push a man too far. The second call was to someone Earl hadn't spoken to in years. Sergeant Reed, an old war buddy who'd traded his rifle for a law degree after returning stateside. Reed had seen the same injustices Earl had, but instead of retreating into quiet resilience, he'd fought back through the courts, carving out victories one case at a time. Earl, Reed's deep voice rumbled through the line. Didn't think I'd hear from you again, old man. What's going on? Earl didn't mince words. I'm being harassed. Kids, backed by the town. Cops won't do a damn thing. Need someone who knows how to fight without throwing punches. There was a pause. Then Reed spoke, voice sharp and sure. Text me the details, I'll make some calls. If they're hiding behind the system, we'll drag them out into the light. By noon, Reed had uncovered more than Earl expected. Kyle's father, Gerald Weaver, wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was one of the biggest donors to the sheriff's re-election campaign. His money kept certain people in power, people who looked the other way when Weaver's son caused trouble. Deputy Carter wasn't just protecting Kyle out of convenience. He was doing it because Kyle's father had paid for that protection, Jasmine's. Investigation added fuel to the fire. She uncovered records showing Weaver's companies had been fined multiple times for labor violations, firing black employees first during layoffs, underpaying workers of color, and retaliating against whistleblowers. But every case had been quietly settled, the victims silenced by non-disclosure agreements. This isn't just about Kyle, Jasmine said, pacing Earl's small living room. It's about power, his father's power. Kyle's just the blunt end of the stick they use to keep people like you in line. Earl leaned on his cane, watching her with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside. Then we break the stick. The plan came together quickly. Earl knew the boys would come for him again. They couldn't resist proving they owned the streets. This time he'd be ready. Jasmine would record everything, but more importantly, Reed had contacted state-level authorities, bypassing the corrupt local system. Federal eyes were now watching. Earl didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, while walking home from the VA clinic, he saw the familiar shapes of Kyle and his gang leaning against the wall of the gas station, cigarettes dangling from careless fingers. Look who's still hobbling around, Kyle called, pushing off the wall with exaggerated swagger. Guess you didn't get the message last time, old man. Earl didn't slow down, he didn't have to. Jasmine, parked down the street, had already gone live on multiple platforms. Her audience was growing by the second, comments flying in, as viewers recognized the man they'd seen abused in previous videos. Kyle followed, flanked by Troy and Blake, while Connor lingered behind, eyes darting nervously. Where you headed, Grandpa? Kyle sneered. Hospital? Cemetery? Earl stopped, turning slowly. His voice was calm, almost conversational. You boys really want to finish this? Right here? In front of the whole world? Kyle blinked, momentarily, thrown off by the confidence in Earl's tone. He didn't see Jasmine's phone angled perfectly to capture the confrontation. World don't care about you, Kyle snapped, stepping closer. Just another nobody. Earl's lips curled into a faint smile. Funny. That's what they told me in Nam. Then they learned the hard way that nobodies fight the hardest. The words hung in the air, weighty with history and defiance. For the first time, doubt flickered in Kyle's eyes, but it was too late to back down. Pride wouldn't allow it. Kyle lunged, hands reaching for Earl's collar. Earl moved faster than anyone expected. His cane swept low, catching Kyle's shin and sending him stumbling forward. Not hard enough to injure, just enough to humiliate. Kyle's momentum carried him into a parked trash bin, knocking it over with a crash. Troy and Blake froze, unsure whether to laugh or jump in. Connor, standing further back, muttered, "Man, this ain't right. Let's go." But Kyle wasn't. Listening. Face flushed with rage, he scrambled to his feet and did something Earl hadn't anticipated. He pulled a knife from his pocket. The world slowed. Jasmine gasped from her hiding spot, camera zooming in. The live stream chat exploded. He's got a weapon. Someone call the cops. This is attempted murder, on video. Earl didn't move. His hands, weathered but steady, remained by his sides. Think carefully, boy, he said softly. That knife's a line you can't uncross. Kyle's hand shook, blade glinting in the sunlight. His bravado cracked, revealing the frightened child beneath. But fear, mixed with pride and humiliation, was a dangerous thing. "Do it," Earl challenged, voice like iron. "Show the world what kind of man you really are." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves. Then Kyle's grip faltered. The knife clattered to the pavement, loud as gunfire in the silence that followed. Before Kyle could react, sirens wailed. 3 black SUVs screeched around the corner, blue lights flashing. Not local cops, federal agents. "Hands where we can see 'em," barked a voice through a bullhorn. "Now!" Kyle froze, eyes wide. Troy bolted, but 2 agents tackled him before he made it 10 steps. Blake raised his hands, stammering, "It wasn't me, man. I didn't touch him." Connor, who hadn't moved during the whole encounter, simply sank to the curb, head in his hands. Kyle, shaking with adrenaline and fear, turned to Earl. You set us up." Earl didn't smile. "No, boy. You set yourself up. I made sure someone was watching this time." The agents moved in, cuffing Kyle and the others. One officer, older, with graying hair and sharp eyes, nodded respectfully at Earl. "You all right, sir?" "Better than them," Earl muttered, watching as Kyle was led away, sputtering about how his father would fix this, but not this time. Jasmine stepped out from her hiding spot, phone still streaming. "It's done," she breathed. "It's finally done." Earl nodded, but the weight on his shoulders didn't lift. Not entirely. The boys were pawns. The real power sat behind desks, writing checks and pulling strings. As if summoned by thought, another SUV rolled up, sleeker and darker than the others. Gerald Weaver stepped out, face thunderous. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, eyes locking onto Earl. The lead agent, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, held up a folder. "Mr. Weaver, you might want to call your lawyer. We've been looking into your business practices. Seems like your son's stupidity finally opened the right doors." Weaver's face turned red, veins bulging at his temples. "You can't do this. I own half this damn town." The agent's smile was thin. "Not anymore, you don't." Earl watched as Weaver was handcuffed, shouting threats no one took seriously. The noise faded into the background as Earl turned to Jasmine. "Think it'll stick?" he asked quietly. Jasmine nodded, eyes bright with victory. "With the feds involved? Yeah, this time it'll stick." But Earl didn't smile. Victory, he'd learned, was never clean. There were always costs. As they walked away from the flashing lights, Earl's cane tapped steadily against the pavement, each step measured and sure. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There'd be backlash, quiet retaliation from those who'd lost power. But Earl wasn't the type to back down. He'd stood his ground once. He'd do it again, as many times as it took. "Do you think Earl was right to fight back, even knowing the risks?" Comment number 1 if you believe standing up against injustice is always worth it. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe no one should have to fight alone. But here's the real question. With the boys arrested and Weaver exposed, is the battle truly over? Or has Earl just lit a fire that will burn even hotter? Stay tuned, because peace is never as simple as it seems. The night after the arrests should have been quiet, peaceful even. But for Earl Johnson, peace was never guaranteed. It was borrowed time, a fragile lull before the next storm. He sat by the window, watching the red and blue lights fade into the distance, cane resting against his knee. Jasmine sat across from him, phone still buzzing with notifications as the live stream replayed on countless platforms. "You did it," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "You stood your ground, and they finally got what they deserved." Earl didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on the street outside, where shadows stretched long under flickering streetlights. "Deserves got nothing to do with it," he muttered. "Weaver's got money, connections. He'll find a way to wriggle out." Jasmine frowned. "The feds have him, Mr. Johnson. This time it's different." Earl turned to her, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Different?" He chuckled bitterly. "Girl, I've been hearing different my whole life. Different after the Civil Rights Act. Different after Vietnam. Different after every damn election. But here I am fighting the same fight at 72. Jasmine fell silent, the weight of his words settling between them. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the scars it left behind. Earl, finally, stood wincing as his hip protested. "I'm tired, real tired, but tired don't mean finished, not yet." The next morning, the retaliation began. It started small. Earl stepped outside to find his mailbox hanging open, letters scattered across the cracked sidewalk. Bills, notices, and one envelope with no return address. He bent slowly, cane steadying his balance, and picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One word, bold and black. "Run." Earl stared at it for a long moment, jaw tightening. He didn't flinch, didn't crumble, just folded the paper neatly and slid it into his pocket. Noise, that's all it was. He'd survived worse, but noise has a way of growing. By noon, his landlord, a wiry man named Marv, who usually avoided confrontation, knocked on the door, hat in hand. "Mr. Johnson," Marv began, not meeting Earl's gaze, "I got a call this morning from the city. They're saying your lease is under review, something about code violations." Earl's eyes narrowed. "Code violations? This place has been standing on prayers and duct tape for years, Marv. You never cared before." Marv shuffled awkwardly. "Ain't my call, Earl, but if they push it, I got to evict. I can't risk fines." Earl nodded slowly, the bitter taste of inevitability rising in his throat. "Figures. They can't break me, so they'll push me out." Marv sighed, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, Earl. You got 30 days. But Earl knew he wouldn't get 30 days. Not with the way things were escalating. That night, the real message came. Earl was dozing in his chair, an old blanket draped across his legs, when the first crash shattered the quiet. Glass exploded inward as a brick sailed through the front window, landing with a dull thud on the worn carpet. Earl was on his feet in an instant, heart pounding but mind sharp. He moved to the window, staying low, peeking through the jagged frame. No faces, just shadows slipping away into the night. Another thud. This time, the side of the building. Spray paint. Red, angry letters spelling out the same word as the letter. "Run!" Earl didn't call the cops. What was the point? Deputy Carter might be sidelined after the federal raid, but the local department was still tainted by Weaver's influence. Instead, Earl picked up the phone and called Jasmine. She arrived within 15 minutes, eyes wide with alarm, as she took in the shattered glass and fresh graffiti. "Mr. Johnson," she breathed, "they're trying to scare you out." Earl's face was stone. "They ain't trying. They're doing it." Jasmine's hands clenched into fists. "We need to call the state authorities, the feds, someone outside this damn town." Earl shook his head. "They'll file a report, send me condolences and move on." "I know how this plays out." "But you can't stay here," Jasmine protested. "They've crossed the line." Earl's gaze didn't waver. "Line was crossed long before this, girl. This ain't the first time I've been told to run." The next morning, the eviction notice came. Official, stamped, and final. Earl had 7 days. 7 days to pack up a lifetime of memories and walk away from the only home he'd known since returning from Vietnam. Jasmine filmed everything, posting updates online, hoping to rally support. But the internet's attention span was short. Yesterday's outrage was today's forgotten headline. Earl packed slowly, methodically, as if each item he placed into worn cardboard boxes was a piece of armor he might need later. The framed photo of his platoon in '68, his mother's Bible, pages worn thin from years of thumbing through Psalms. The flag they'd handed him at his brother's funeral, folded sharp and tight. But the hardest part was the corner shelf, the one holding medals no one cared about. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, service ribbons that had once meant something, but now felt like relics of a fight that never truly ended. On the fourth night, it got worse. Earl had just finished taping up a box when he heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Not the careless swagger of teenagers, professionals. He killed the lights, moving quietly to the window. 2 figures stood by his truck, men in dark clothes, faces obscured by caps. One held a crowbar, the other a can of something that sloshed. With each step, gasoline. Earl didn't hesitate. He reached for the old revolver tucked in the drawer by the couch, a relic from another life, cleaned and oiled despite years of disuse. He stepped onto the porch, cane in one hand, pistol in the other, voice cold and clear. "Step away from the truck." The men froze. One lifted his hands slowly, the other hesitating before dropping the gas can with a hollow thud. "Didn't. Think you had it in you, old man," one muttered. Earl's grip didn't waver. "You thought wrong." They backed away, disappearing into the night. But the message was clear. Leave, or next time, they wouldn't just burn the truck. By dawn, Earl had made his decision. He wasn't running. He was digging in. Jasmine arrived with coffee, dark circles under her eyes. "Mr. Johnson, we can't keep playing defense. They're escalating. This is life or death now." Earl nodded slowly. "I know. That's why it's time to flip the script." Reed, the civil rights attorney, called later that day with news. "Earl, I've got state investigators looking into Weaver's holdings. Seems your video kicked over a hornet's nest, but the local authorities are dragging their feet. They're hoping you'll leave so the heat dies down." "They're gonna be disappointed," Earl replied. Reed paused. "Earl, you sure about this? They've already taken your home. What's left to fight for?" Earl looked around the half-empty apartment, eyes settling on the flag folded neatly by the door. "Dignity," he said quietly. "That's always worth fighting for." That night, Earl slept in the recliner, revolver within reach, but sleep didn't come easy. Memories flickered, jungles thick with humidity, the crack of gunfire, whispered prayers in foxholes. He'd survived hell once. He'd survived this too. But survival had a cost, and Earl was prepared to pay it. The next morning, the final blow came, not from a brick or a knife, but from a system designed to grind men like Earl into dust. His VA benefits, steady for decades, were suddenly under review. The letter cited irregularities in his service record, a flimsy excuse, but enough to freeze payments. No money, no roof, no options. Jasmine was furious. "This is retaliation. They're weaponizing the system against you." Earl folded the letter carefully, placing it atop the growing pile of injustices. "That's how they've always done. It quiet, clean, no fingerprints." But quiet didn't mean invisible. Earl wasn't alone anymore. Jasmine's network had grown. Civil rights groups, veteran advocates, even a few sympathetic journalists from the city were watching now. And Earl, ever the soldier, had one last battle plan. He picked up the phone and called Reed. "It's time. We take this public. Full scale." Reed didn't hesitate. "I'll draft the statement. We'll make it too big to ignore." And so the war shifted, from dark alleys and whispered threats to press conferences and headlines. Earl stood on the courthouse steps 2 days later, flanked by veterans and activists, microphone crackling as cameras rolled. "I fought for this country," Earl began, voice steady despite the weight of years and battles fought, not just overseas but right here, on streets where my skin made me a target. "I didn't ask for this fight, but I'll be damned if I run from it." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others wiping away tears. Earl's gaze swept over them. Finding Jasmine in the front row, phone raised, live streaming to an audience that now stretched far beyond their small town. "They tried to break me," Earl continued. "Tried to take my home, my peace, my dignity. But they forgot one thing. I've faced death before, and I'm still here." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Earl didn't smile. Victory, if it came, would be bittersweet. He'd lost too much already. As the sun set behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across cracked pavement, Earl stood tall, cane planted firmly beside him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't fighting alone. Earl Johnson stood on the cracked sidewalk outside his apartment, cane planted firmly beside him, watching the world move on as if it hadn't just tried to erase him. The eviction notice, the slashed tires on his truck, the freezing of his VA benefits, each blow designed to push him into the shadows, to remind him that men like him weren't meant to fight back and win. But Earl was still standing. Jasmine sat on the hood of her car nearby, phone in hand, watching him with the kind of worried determination that only came from someone who refused to accept defeat. "Mr. Johnson," she said quietly, "the press conference helped, but it's not enough. Weaver's people are already spinning it, calling you a troublemaker, saying you stirred this up for attention." Earl chuckled, the sound dry and humorless. Attention? Only attention I ever wanted was a quiet life. They can spin all they want. I'm not done. Jasmine leaned forward, brows furrowed. So what's the plan? You're out of time. They're pushing you into a corner. Earl's gaze didn't waver. Then we push back. Harder. Louder. We make it so they can't sweep this under the rug. The plan was risky, reckless even, but Earl had nothing left to lose. His home was already gone. His reputation had been dragged through the mud. The only thing he had was his dignity, and the knowledge that silence would mean surrender. Earl reached out to Reed, his old war buddy turned civil rights attorney. "Reed," Earl said, voice steady despite the weight of what he was about. To ask, "I need you to pull every string you've got. We're taking this fight straight to the heart of town." Reed didn't hesitate. "Say the word, Earl. I've got media contacts ready. But you know this means painting a target on your back. A bigger one." Earl's lips thinned into a grim smile. "Target's already there, might as well make it count." The trap was simple. Earl would confront Kyle and his gang publicly, on neutral ground, with every camera Jasmine could gather, aimed squarely at the scene. It wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure, forcing their hand, making sure their violence wasn't just another whispered story swept under the rug. Jasmine hesitated when Earl explained the plan. "You're baiting them," she said, voice tight with worry. "If they don't back down, this could get ugly. Real ugly." Earl nodded. Ugly's all they know, but this time, the world's gonna see it. The location was carefully chosen. The park near downtown, broad and open, surrounded by public buildings and surveillance cameras. Jasmine spread the word quietly, rallying community members, activists, and a few sympathetic reporters. The story had gained enough traction that people were paying attention, just enough to make this confrontation impossible to ignore. Earl arrived first, cane tapping against the pavement as he walked toward the park bench at the center of the green. He sat down slowly, back straight, eyes scanning the horizon like an old soldier waiting for the enemy to crest the hill. He didn't wait long. Kyle, Troy, and Blake swaggered into view, their usual bravado wrapped around them like armor. Connor trailed behind, head down, hands stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets. Earl's lips pressed into a thin line. He'd seen that look before, in young soldiers sent into battle without understanding the cost. Kyle spotted Earl and grinned, the kind of grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Look who's still hobbling around," he called, voice loud enough to draw attention. "Didn't get the message last time, old man." Earl didn't rise, didn't flinch. He just leaned on his cane and met Kyle's gaze. Message was, "Loud and clear, boy, just didn't much care for it." The tension thickened, pulling bystanders' eyes toward the unfolding scene. Jasmine stood at the edge of the crowd, phone raised, live stream already running. Comments poured in faster than she could read. "Is this happening right now? That old man's got guts. Where the hell are the cops?" Kyle stepped closer, jaw tightening. "You got a death wish, Grandpa?" Earl's gaze didn't waver. "Nah, just a wish for justice. Thought maybe you'd finally show the world what kind of coward you really are." That did it. Kyle's face flushed red and his hand shot out, shoving Earl's shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. But Earl had expected it. He didn't fall. He stood tall, cane planted like a flagpole. The cameras caught everything. "Look at you," Earl said quietly, voice carrying despite the gathering crowd's murmurs. "Big man picking fights with someone 3 times your age. That what passes for strength these days?" Troy and Blake laughed nervously, but Connor didn't. His eyes flickered to Jasmine's phone, realization dawning. "Kyle," Connor muttered, tugging at his friend's sleeve. "Cameras. Everyone's watching." But Kyle was too far gone, pride drowning reason. "I don't give a damn who's watching," he snapped, stepping closer. "Ain't nobody gonna care when you're gone." And then, like before, the knife appeared. Jasmine's gasp cut through the crowd's hushed whispers. The live stream. Chat exploded. "He's got a knife! Someone call the cops! This is attempted murder, on video!" Earl didn't move. His eyes locked on the blade, then drifted back to Kyle's face. Calm. Unshaken. "Think carefully, boy," Earl said softly. "That knife? That's a one-way ticket. You ready for where it takes you?" For a moment, the world held its breath. Kyle's hand trembled, blade catching the sunlight as doubt flickered in his eyes. But pride always burned hotter. The knife jerked forward. Earl didn't dodge. He didn't need to. Two sharp cracks split the air. Rubber bullets fired from the edge of the park. Kyle's hand snapped back as the knife clattered to the ground. He staggered, eyes wide, disbelief painted across his face. Federal agents swarmed in, plainclothes officers moving with practiced efficiency. Kyle hit the pavement, arms yanked behind his back, cuffs snapping into place. Troy and Blake didn't even try to run. Connor dropped to the curb, hands raised, face pale. The crowd erupted, not in panic but in vindication. Jasmine kept the camera steady, voice shaking as she narrated. It's over. They tried to come for him again. And this time the law was actually watching. Earl exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. He bent, ignoring the protest in his hip, and picked up the knife, holding it up for the cameras to see. This, he said, voice clear despite the years weighing it down, ain't strength. This is fear. And fear don't win when the truth's watching. The agents helped Earl upright, one of them, an older black man with tired eyes and a crisp suit, nodding respectfully. We got everything on video, Mr. Johnson. They won't wiggle out of this one. Earl nodded, jaw tight. About damn time. As the crowd began to thin, reporters swarming the scene, Jasmine lowered her phone and hurried over. You okay? She asked, eyes wide with concern. Earl gave a faint smile. Better than them. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Kyle was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, intent to harm, and several lesser offenses. Weaver's influence had waned under federal scrutiny, and without his father's protection, Kyle was just another thug facing real consequences. But the victory was bitter. Earl's home was still gone. His benefits remained frozen in bureaucratic limbo. The system had been wounded, not broken. As Earl stood on the courthouse steps days later, reporters crowding close, one question cut through the noise. Mr. Johnson, do you feel justice was served? Earl looked past the cameras, past the microphones, eyes settling on Jasmine standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. He thought of the nights spent watching shadows move outside his window, the cold weight of eviction notices, the sting of slurs muttered under breath. Justice? Earl said slowly, voice steady. Justice ain't a finish line, it's a fight. And we ain't done fighting, the cameras clicked, headlines formed. But Earl didn't care. He'd made his stand, not just for himself, but for every man and woman who'd ever been told to know their place. Do you think Earl was right to confront Kyle, even knowing the risk? Comment number 1. If you believe standing up against injustice is always worth it. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe silence only empowers bullies. But here's the real question. With Kyle arrested and the truth exposed, has Earl finally won? Or is this just another battle in a war that never truly ends? Stay tuned, because for men like Earl, peace is never promised. Earl Johnson sat on a weathered bench outside the courthouse, cane resting across his lap. The morning sun cast long shadows, stretching across cracked pavement and silent streets. The park, usually bustling with dog walkers and children, felt oddly empty. A reflection perhaps of how Earl himself felt after the dust had settled. Kyle was in custody, facing multiple charges that wouldn't be swept under the rug this time. His father, Gerald Weaver, had been hit with federal indictments, not just for corruption, but for tax fraud and labor violations unearthed by Reed's legal team. It was the kind of blow that shattered illusions of untouchability. The Weaver name, once synonymous with power in this town, was now a stain local officials scrambled to distance themselves from. But victory, Earl had learned long ago, never came without casualties. His apartment was gone. The eviction had gone through despite protests from advocacy groups, citing property redevelopment as the official reason. The VA benefits remained in bureaucratic limbo, stuck in a system designed to exhaust rather than assist. Earl had fought, won, and yet found himself standing among the ashes of his old life, the taste of victory bitter on his tongue. Jasmine sat beside him, phone buzzing with notifications she barely glanced at. Her article, Vietnam Vet Defies Corruption, Sparkstown Reckoning, had gone viral, drawing attention from national media. Offers for interviews poured in, but Earl declined every single one. "I didn't fight this for 15 minutes. Of fame," he muttered, watching a stray dog nose through an overturned trash can across the street. "Fame don't pay rent, don't put food on the table." Jasmine sighed, running a hand through her curls. "It's not about fame, Mr. Johnson. It's about visibility. The more people see what happened here, the harder it'll be for them to pull the same tricks again." Earl glanced sideways, eyes sharp despite the fatigue weighing down his frame. "You really believe that, girl?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "I want to. Isn't that enough?" Earl didn't answer. Hope was a luxury he'd long since stopped indulging. A rusted pickup pulled up to the curb, and Reed stepped out, suit rumpled, tie loosened. He waved a folder like a victory flag. "Got something for you, Earl. Ain't much, but it's a start." Earl stood slowly, joints protesting the movement. "Better not be another pile of paperwork," Reed grinned. "Better. Emergency housing approval. The state stepped in once the feds exposed how deep Weaver's corruption ran. They're fast-tracking. Veterans impacted by local mismanagement. You'll have a roof over your head by the end of the day." For the first time in days, Earl allowed himself a small smile. "Guess miracles ain't just for Sundays." Reed's expression sobered. "It's temporary, Earl, and they're still dragging their feet on your benefits. Weaver's influence might be gone, but the machine grinds slow." Earl nodded, gaze drifting to the courthouse steps where Kyle had been led away in cuffs just days before. Slow's better than stopped. As they walked toward Reed's truck, Jasmine trailing behind, Earl paused. Across the street, Connor stood alone, hands stuffed deep in his pockets, eyes downcast. The only one from Kyle's crew who'd hesitated, who'd muttered, "This ain't right," when things had escalated. Earl met Jasmine's questioning glance and nodded toward the boy. "Give me a minute." He crossed the street slowly, each step deliberate, cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. Connor looked up, startled, and for a moment, Earl saw fear flash in the boy's eyes. Not the cocky defiance Kyle had worn like a badge, but real fear, the kind that came from understanding consequences too late. "Mr. Johnson," Connor muttered, shifting awkwardly. "I didn't—" Earl raised a hand, cutting him off. "Ain't here to scold you, boy. Just got a question." Connor swallowed hard. "Yeah? You knew it was wrong. Why'd you stay with him?" The boy looked away, scuffing his sneaker against the curb. "Kyle. He runs things. You go against him, you're next. And my old man always said, keep your head down. Don't make waves." He glanced back, shame tightening his features. "Guess I listened too well." Earl nodded slowly. He'd seen it before. Good kids pulled under by stronger currents, too scared to swim against the tide until it was too late. "Well," Earl said quietly, "tide's turned now. Question. Is you gonna keep floating or start paddling?" Connor blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" Earl leaned on his cane, gaze steady. "Jasmine's looking for volunteers at the community center. Tutoring, food drives, the kind of work that builds instead of tears down. You want out of Kyle's shadow? Start by standing in your own light." Connor hesitated, uncertainty warring with something deeper. Hope, maybe. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, okay, I'll talk to her." Earl stepped back, satisfied. "Good. Ain't never too late to do right, boy. Just don't wait till the clock runs out." By the time Earl climbed into Reed's truck, the weight on his chest had eased, if only slightly. Jasmine smiled faintly. "Recruiting the next generation? Already?" Earl snorted. "Somebody's got to fix this town when I'm gone." They drove in silence, passing familiar streets now stripped of Weaver's campaign posters and the thin veneer of civility that had hidden decades of corruption. Change, Earl knew, was slow and ugly, but it was change nonetheless. The new apartment was modest. A single-story unit in a complex filled with other veterans, most as worn and stubborn as Earl himself. The walls were bare, the furniture functional, but the roof didn't leak, and the locks worked. That was enough. As Reed helped carry the last box inside, he clapped Earl on the shoulder. "You did good, old man, real good." Earl didn't smile. "Good don't bring back what's gone, but it keeps the wolves at bay." That night, Earl sat by the window, sipping coffee gone cold, watching the world settle into uneasy quiet. He'd won, technically. Kyle was off the streets, Weaver's empire was crumbling. The town had been forced to confront its rot, but victory, Earl knew, was never clean. The scars remained, on buildings, on people, on trust. He'd fought his fight, but the war never truly ended. As the clock ticked past midnight, Earl reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded eviction notice, the last remnant of the life they'd tried to strip away. Slowly, methodically, he fed it into the ashtray, on the windowsill watching the edges curl and blacken. When the last ember died, Earl leaned back, eyes drifting closed for the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. The battle was over. For now. But Earl Johnson had lived long enough to know peace was fleeting, and when the next fight came, as it always did, he'd be ready. Cane in hand, head held high, standing not just for himself, but for every soul told to sit down and stay quiet. Because silence, Earl knew, was the enemy's greatest weapon, and he'd be damned if he ever wielded it again. 1 year later, the town looked different. Not completely changed. Racism didn't vanish overnight, and power never surrendered without clawing for survival. But cracks had formed in the foundation of silence. And cracks, Earl Johnson knew, were where the light got in. The community center stood at the corner of Ashland and Maple, a once-abandoned grocery store now repurposed into a hub for after-school programs, job training, and veteran support. The sign above the door was simple, but powerful. Johnson Center for Justice and Resilience. Earl hadn't wanted his name on it, but Jasmine had insisted. People need to know who stood tall when the world tried to knock him down, she'd argued. Earl had grumbled but relented. Fighting her determination was like arguing with the Yi. Tucked inside, the walls were lined with photos, not just of the bus incident, though a framed newspaper clipping hung near the entrance, the headline bold and defiant, "Vietnam Veteran Sparks Change in Small Town." There were pictures of kids reading with volunteers, families picking up groceries from the food pantry, veterans sharing coffee and stories in a corner lounge. Life rebuilding itself piece by piece. Earl sat near the front desk, Kane leaning against his chair, watching as Connor, once a hesitant follower in Kyle's gang, now led a tutoring session for middle schoolers struggling with math. The boy moved with quiet confidence, explaining equations with the patience of someone who understood what it felt like to be lost. Jasmine entered, juggling a stack of flyers and her ever-present phone. "VA finally cleared your benefits," she announced, dropping into the chair beside Earl. "Back pay and all, guess they figured you weren't going away." Earl chuckled, shaking his head. "Took 'em long enough. Government moves slower than molasses in winter." Jasmine smiled but didn't press. They both knew the victory was hard-won and fragile. One shift in power, one new face behind a desk, and the fight would start all over again. But for now, they'd carved out a space where justice had roots. The town itself had shifted too. Gerald Weaver's empire had collapsed under the weight of federal charges. His properties were auctioned off, and his influence drained like water from a cracked jug. Kyle, once the untouchable prince of privilege, sat in state custody, serving time for assault and weapons charges. Word was he'd lost most of his swagger behind bars. Without his father's shadow shielding him, Kyle had learned the hard way that real strength didn't come from fear. But the system, as always, found ways to resist change. Deputy Carter, though removed from his post after the federal investigation, had resurfaced in private security, still circling power like a vulture. Some storefronts still turned their lights off early when black families walked by. The old prejudices lingered, stubborn and deep-rooted. Earl knew better than to expect a perfect ending. Life didn't work that way, but victory, he'd learned, wasn't about erasing the fight. It was about standing long enough, loud enough that others found the courage to stand too. The center's front door chimed as a young woman entered, hand in hand with a little boy no older than 5. She glanced around, uncertain, until Jasmine stood and offered a warm smile. "Can I help you?" Jasmine asked, setting her phone aside. The woman nodded. "I heard you help veterans' families. My brother, he served. PTSD hit him hard. He's getting help now, but his little one..." She gestured to the boy who clung to her side, wide-eyed and silent. "He needs somewhere safe, somewhere stable." Earl leaned forward, voice calm and steady. "You came to the right place. We've got after-school programs, meals, counseling if you need it. No judgment, no red tape, just community. The woman's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. I didn't know where else to go. Earl nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in the closest thing to a smile he ever gave. Now you do. As Jasmine led them deeper into the center, Earl stood slowly, joints protesting but spirit steady. He walked to the window, cane tapping softly against the floor, and looked out at the street beyond. Kids rode bikes past storefronts once cold and unwelcoming. Neighbors, black and white, chatted over coffee at the corner cafe. The town hadn't been transformed, not completely, but it had shifted. And sometimes a shift was enough to start a revolution. His phone buzzed on the table, another unknown number. Earl's gut tightened, a reflex born from too many threats, too many warnings scrawled in red paint. He picked it up, thumb hovering over the screen. The message was brief. Just 2 words. Not finished? Earl stared at it for a long moment. The past would always fight to reclaim ground, to undo progress hard won. But Earl Johnson had faced worse than anonymous threats. He'd faced war, systemic oppression, and the crushing weight of decades spent fighting battles no one wanted to acknowledge. He smiled faintly, deleting the message without reply. Damn right it's not finished, he muttered, watching Connor high-five one of the kids across the room. Good thing neither am I. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows down the street. But inside the Johnson Center, the light stayed bright, the hum of quiet resistance steady and strong. Earl turned from the window, picked up his cane, and walked toward the heart of the center, a man who'd fought not just to survive, but to ensure the fight never ended with him. Because justice, Earl knew, wasn't a destination, it was a journey, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. And as long as he drew breath, Earl Johnson would make damn sure the light kept shining through the cracks. Earl Johnson's story is more than just a tale of survival. It's a testament to resilience, dignity, and the power of standing tall when the world demands you bow. From the moment Kyle and his gang picked the wrong target on that bus, Earl's journey exposed the deep-rooted systems of injustice that often operate quietly, unchecked, until someone refuses to stay silent. Earl didn't fight for revenge. He fought for respect, for himself, for every veteran ignored after service, for every black man told to know his place. His battle wasn't just against a gang of teenagers or a corrupt businessman. It was against a system designed to wear people down until they stopped fighting back. And yet Earl's victory wasn't clean. He lost his home, faced threats, and endured the kind of stress that breaks lesser spirits. But he gained something far more valuable, a legacy. The Johnson Center now stands not just as a building, but as a beacon for those who've been told they don't belong. Proof that one voice, steady and unyielding, can shake the pillars of oppression. This story reminds us that true strength isn't found in fists or threats, but in the courage to face adversity without losing your integrity. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to lift others up, even when the odds are stacked against you. Now it's your turn to reflect. If you were in Earl's shoes, would you have fought back, knowing the risks? Comment number 1 if you believe standing up against injustice is always worth it. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It's through spreading stories like Earl's that we remind the world silence is never the answer. Thank you for watching. And remember, real change starts when ordinary people decide enough is enough. Stay strong, stay aware, and take care. Until next time.